went quiet before anyone understood why. It was a kind of silence that doesn't announce itself. It simply spreads, like a cold current moving beneath warm water, touching each person at the table before they quite realize what they're feeling. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. And then someone near the far end of the long mahogany dining table whispered a name, and the whole magnificent room seemed to contract around it. Marilyn Monroe had fallen, not gracefully, not the way the cameras always caught her. That luminous, slow-motion tumble of golden hair and white fabric that made falling look like a kind of performance. This was different. This was the body giving out without warning, without drama, without permission. Her chair scraped back against the polished floor to sound like a gunshot, and she went sideways, and the crystal glass she'd been holding shattered against the edge of the table on its way down. And then there was nothing but the sound of people scrambling to their feet and the distant tinkle of ice on marble. Dean Martin was out of his seat before the glass finished breaking. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and the guests, some of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, people whose names alone could fill a theater, parted for him without thinking. Because in that moment, Dean Martin was not a performer, not a Rat Pack legend, not the man whose easy grin had charmed a generation. He was simply a man moving towards someone who had fallen, and his face carried something no one in that room had ever seen on it before. Fear. Real, unperformed, unguarded fear. She was on the floor when he reached her, the ivory dress she'd worn that evening. A slip of fabric so pale it seemed to gather all the candlelight in the room, had pulled around her like something spilled. Her eyes were open. That was the first thing he noticed. Open and moving, tracking slowly across the ceiling in a way that wasn't quite right. The way eyes move in a dream when the dreamer doesn't know they're being watched. Marilyn. He said it quietly, the way you say a name when you're not sure the person can hear you. He crouched beside her, and someone handed him a folded napkin, and he didn't quite know what to do with it. So he just held it. Marilyn, can you hear me? She turned her head toward his voice, and something in her expression, something beneath the confusion and the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin, looked like recognition. And then it looked like relief. And then it looked like something else entirely. Something that made the people watching feel like they were intruding on a private moment that had no business being witnessed by a room full of dinner guests. She said something. Only Dean heard it. He leaned closer, and she said it again, and he straightened up slowly and looked at the room with an expression nobody present would ever fully agree on in the retellings that followed. Some said he looked afraid. Some said he looked angry. One woman, a studio executive's wife who had been seated close enough to observe his face clearly, would later insist, in hushed conversations at other dinner parties, other tables, other evenings full of California wine and easy laughter, that what she saw on Dean Martin's face in that moment was a look of a man who had just been told something he already knew, something he had been hoping, against everything, not to hear confirmed. The ambulance was called. The guests were asked, politely but firmly, to wait in the adjoining sitting room. And it was in the controlled, professional minutes that followed, as the paramedics arrived and the house staff moved quietly through the room gathering glasses and righting toppled chairs, that someone noticed a purse. It was a small thing, a cream-colored clutch, barely large enough to hold a compact and a tube of lipstick. It had slid from the table when Marilyn fell, and it had come open when it hit the floor, and what had spilled from it lay arranged on a marble in a pattern so quietly, devastatingly revealing that the young police officer who first observed it, a 24-year-old who had been on the job for less than a year and who had responded to calls simply because he was nearest, would describe it years later as the moment his understanding of the world permanently changed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before you can understand what was in that purse, you need to understand what the evening was supposed to be, what was meant to celebrate, and the extraordinary, almost theatrical distance between the party Dean Martin had planned and the truth that purse made impossible to ignore. The year was 1961. By any measure the outside world could apply, Marilyn Monroe was at a kind of peak. Her face was on every magazine. Her name was spoken in the same breath as words like icon and legend and once in a generation. The kind of language that gets applied to people while they're still alive only when everyone secretly suspects the living version won't be available much longer. She had just completed a film. She had recently survived a marriage that many people in Hollywood had privately predicted would destroy her. She was by all the visible metrics of a culture obsessed with visible metrics, surviving. But the people who actually knew her, the small, complicated constellation of friends and colleagues and complicated intimates who orbited her real life rather than her public one, had been watching something else entirely. They had been watching the gaps between the performances, the long silences on telephone calls, the canceled appearances, the way she sometimes arrived at gatherings already somewhere else, her eyes carrying particular vacancy of a person who's been working very hard, for a very long time, to maintain a version of themselves they no longer entirely believe in. Dean Martin had known Marilyn Monroe for years by 1961. Their friendship was one of those Hollywood arrangements that defies easy categorization. Part professional alliance, part genuine affection, threaded through with a specific tenderness that sometimes grows between people who have independently survived the same industry's particular cruelties. He understood her in the way that people understand each other, when they both spent their lives performing warm for strangers, while carefully rationing the real thing for private moments. He saw her, not all of her. Nobody ever saw all of her, including Marilyn herself, but enough to know that the woman who arrived at his home that evening in the pale ivory dress and the careful, practiced smile was not entirely present, not entirely well, and carrying something in that small cream-colored purse that she had not told anyone about. The dinner had been arranged quickly, as Dean's gatherings often were. A phone call here, a standing invitation there, the easy magnetism of a man for whom social orchestration was second nature. There were perhaps 14 people at the table that evening. Not all of them have been willing to speak about what they witnessed. Of those who have, the account are consistent on the broad strokes and diverge, sometimes dramatically, on the details that turn out to matter most. Everyone agrees that Marilyn arrived late. This was not unusual. Lateness was a language she had been speaking since the beginning of her career, and like all languages, it carried meanings beyond its surface. Sometimes defiance, sometimes anxiety, sometimes the simple, sad logic of a person who found it very hard to walk into a room full of watching eyes without extensive preparation. That evening, the preparation had clearly been considerable. She was, by multiple accounts, stunning. The kind of stunning that produces a brief, involuntary silence in a room full of people who are professionally accustomed to beauty. She took her seat. She accepted a glass of wine she barely touched. She spoke when spoken to, and she laughed at the right moments, and she leaned forward with apparent interest during a story someone was telling about a location shoot in Morocco, and to anyone watching from a distance, she was simply Marilyn Monroe at a dinner party, doing what Marilyn Monroe did at dinner parties. But Dean was watching from close up. He noticed that she held her fork for long stretches without using it. He noticed that she twice began sentences and then stopped midway, and seemed to lose the thread of what she meant to say, covering the lapse with smiles so practiced it had become involuntary. He noticed that her left hand, resting in her lap below the tablecloth, was not resting at all. Her fingers were moving against the fabric of her dress in a repetitive gesture, pressing and releasing, the way people move their hands when the rest of their body has been commanded to stay still. He leaned toward her once, early in the meal, and asked quietly if she was all right. She turned in with the full wattage of her attention, that specific, extraordinary quality of presence she could deploy when she chose to, the thing that made people feel they were the only person in whatever room she occupied, and said that she was wonderful, that the food was wonderful, that she was so glad he'd called, that she'd been thinking lately they didn't see enough of each other, that life moved so fast. It was a perfect answer. It answered nothing. The meal continued. The candles burned lower. The conversation moved through its familiar Hollywood territory, projects in development, contracts under negotiation, the eternal industry, whether of who was ascending and who was falling and who had done what to whom and what it all meant. Marilyn participated and withdrew and participated again, a tide with its own rhythm, and the evening should have concluded, as these evenings typically did, with lingering goodnights on the front steps, cars pulling out of the circular drive, the comfortable deflation of a successful gathering returning to ordinary night. But then the glass fell, and then the silence came, and then there was Marilyn Monroe on the floor of Dean Martin's dining room, and there was a cream-colored clutch purse lying open on the marble, and there were things inside it that were about to make the evening impossible to contain. The young officer's name was Robert Callahan. He had been a police officer for 11 months when he responded to the call at Dean Martin's residence that Tuesday evening. He had grown up in Burbank. He had 3 younger sisters. He went to Mass on Sundays. He was, by his own later description, a person of relatively uncomplicated faith in the fundamental orderliness of the world, a faith that the following hours would not survive intact. He arrived after the ambulance, but before the situation had been fully processed by the people managing it. The house was large enough, and the staff professional enough, that different zones of the evening were proceeding simultaneously. Paramedics attending to Marilyn in the dining room, guests being shepherded toward the sitting room, Dean Martin standing in the hallway in particular stillness of a man waiting to be told how serious things are. Callahan moved through the house with the careful attention of someone doing their job in an environment their job had not quite prepared them for, and it was this careful attention that brought his eyes to the floor near the head of the table. The purse had been overlooked in the controlled movement of people and the management of the immediate medical situation. The small cream-colored clutch had simply not been gathered up with the other personal effects. It lay where it had landed, its clasp open, its contents partially visible against the pale marble floor. What Callahan saw when he crouched to examine it, and what he was careful, professionally careful, not to touch or disturb before he'd made his assessment, was not what he expected to find in the personal effects of a woman at a private dinner party. There were, as one might expect, ordinary items: a compact, a folded handkerchief with an embroidered M in one corner, a tube of red lipstick, a small amount of cash, folded carefully, and then there were the other things. There were several small prescription bottles. This alone was not remarkable. Prescription medication in the purse of a woman of Marilyn Monroe's documented medical history was not surprising. But the bottles, and Callahan counted them carefully 3 times because the number seemed wrong, were not all prescribed to the same person. One was made out to her. The second was made out to someone whose name Callahan did not recognize. The third, and this was the one that made him stay crouched on the cold marble floor longer than the situation technically required, was prescribed to a doctor, not to a patient, to a physician, a specific physician whose name, at that moment, meant little to Robert Callahan, but whose name he would find, in the weeks and months that followed, attached to an extraordinary web of connections, favors, transactions, and silences that reached from the examining rooms of Beverly Hills to offices in Washington, D.C. that had nothing to do with medicine. He wrote down the names. All 3. He wrote down the prescription information. He wrote down the quantities, the amounts that should have been in the bottles if they'd been full, and the amounts that remained. He was thorough. He was professional. He did everything his training had told him to do. And then he stood up, and he carried his notebook out of the dining room, and he walked directly into 11 months of pressure that would eventually convince a 24-year-old man from Burbank, who went to Mass on Sundays, that some information was simply too dangerous to hold. But before we follow that thread, before we trace what those names on those prescription bottles eventually unraveled, we need to stay in the room a little longer, because Callahan was not the only one who saw what was in that purse. And the second person who saw it had reasons to care that were entirely different from professional obligation. Her name has never been published. She appears in no account of that evening that was recorded for public consumption, because the people managing the situation were very good at their jobs, and one of the things their jobs required was the management of witnesses. But she was there. She had been at the dinner. She had been seated close enough to Marilyn Monroe to have noticed, earlier in the evening, that the cream-colored purse had been handled with particular, almost compulsive frequency, opened and reclosed, checked and rechecked, the way you check something when you're uncertain whether you've made a decision about it yet. She saw the purse fall. She saw it spilled. And unlike Callahan, who was cataloging evidence, she was identifying something she recognized. The name on the second prescription bottle, the name that didn't belong to Marilyn. She knew that name. She had heard it in a context that had nothing to do with medicine and nothing to do with Hollywood. In a conversation she had not been meant to overhear. In a house that was not this house. At a party that seemed on the surface to be just another party. Until 2 men stepped into a study and closed the door, and she found herself seated in a garden chair on the other side of the wall with nothing between her and their conversation but a screen door and the sound of cicadas. She had heard a name. She had not understood, at the time, why the name was significant. She understood now. She did not say anything that evening. She gathered herself and she joined the other guests in the sitting room, and she accepted the glass of brandy someone pressed into her hands, and she was, by all external measures, simply a woman shaken by the distressing spectacle of someone collapsing at dinner. She was very good at appearing to be simply whatever a situation called for. This too was a Hollywood skill. In some circles, it was the most important one. She left when the guests were finally permitted to leave. She drove home through the canyon roads with the radio off and her hands very steady on the steering wheel. And she did not sleep that night. And in the morning, she made a phone call she had been putting off for a long time to a person she trusted more than most and feared almost as much. And she said, "I need to tell you something about a name I heard and about what I saw last night." Marilyn Monroe was taken to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. Her condition was described in the careful language of people very practiced in the art of careful language, as exhaustion compounded by medication interactions. She was admitted, she was sedated, she recovered. Over the following days, in the way that people recover from events their bodies understand better than their minds do, slowly, unevenly, with periods of frightening clarity and periods of grateful blankness, Dean Martin visited. He sat beside her bed with his characteristic stillness, the quality that people who only knew his public self always found surprising, the calm, undemonstrative presence of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the most powerful thing you could offer a person in genuine distress was simply your continued presence without demand. He didn't perform concern. He was concerned. He sat with it. She told him, in fragments, over 2 visits, what she had been managing. Not all of it. There were parts she had not yet told herself in any organized way, parts that existed in the inchoate emotional territory between awareness and acknowledgement. But enough. She told him about the prescriptions. She told him about the doctor. She told him something about why she had the other bottles, the ones not made out to her, and what she had been asked to do with them and by whom, and what she had been given in return. Dean Martin was not a naive man. He had spent 2 decades in industry that ran on leverage and currency of all kinds, and he understood how people acquired things over other people and what those things were worth. But what she was describing operated at a scale and in a context that even he found difficult to fully absorb in the ambient noise of a hospital room with fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a floor polisher working its way down the corridor. She had been used. That was the simplest version. She had been used as a transport mechanism. A person so famous, so universally recognized, so thoroughly watched by photographers and fans and the machinery of celebrity, that the last thing anyone would look for in her possession was something that needed to move quietly. The purse was always photographed. Her outfits were always photographed. Her arrivals and departures were always photographed. She was, paradoxically, invisible in a way that only the extremely visible can be invisible. She had become so much of a known quantity, so fully mapped and categorized as a cultural object, that what she actually carried on her person was simply not a category of information anyone thought to track. This had been identified by someone, and she had been not forced. She was clear about that. Not forced. Asked and offered something in return. Something she had wanted badly enough that the asking had felt, in the moment, like a reasonable transaction. What she had been offered and what she had received, and whether she had understood the full nature of what she was transporting. These are the questions that branch in several directions simultaneously, and each direction leads somewhere that casts a different light on everything that came before. Robert Callahan, meanwhile, had filed his report. He had done it correctly, by the book, because that was how he did things. He had documented the purse and its contents and the 3 prescription bottles and the names on them with the same methodical completeness. He brought to every task his job required. He had submitted the report through the appropriate channels. He had, as far as the professional obligations were concerned, done everything right. The call came 4 days later. It came not from his direct supervisor, which would have been the expected channel, but from someone above his supervisor, someone whose title and position in the department Callahan was aware of, but had never had reason to interact with directly. The conversation was brief and professionally cordial. It was explained to Callahan that his report had been reviewed, that it had been determined the situation was a medical matter, not a criminal one, that the prescription details he had documented were within normal parameters for the patient's documented medical history. that the report had been filed appropriately, and that no further action was required. Callahan said he understood. He was told that the matter was closed. He said he understood that too. The call ended. He sat at his desk for a while, in the particular stillness of a person processing a communication that said one thing on the surface and something completely different underneath. He was 24. He had 3 younger sisters. He went to mass on Sundays. He had been on the job for 11 months, and he had already encountered, in that time, the normal friction between the way things were supposed to work and the way they actually worked, the small accommodations and willful oversights and bureaucratic pragmatisms that exist in any large institution. He had filed his away as the ordinary texture of institutional life and continued to do his job well. But this felt different, not in kind, exactly in scale, in the particular quality of the silence around it. The way of fact becomes louder when people start working to keep it quiet. He wrote the names in his personal notebook, not his work notebook, his personal one, a small brown thing he kept in his breast pocket out of a habit formed in high school when he'd read a biography of a journalist he admired. He wrote the names and the prescription information and the date and the name of the person who had called him. He wrote them in his own shorthand, in the back of the notebook, after the grocery lists and the phone numbers and the other casual detritus of a 24-year-old's daily life. He wrote them in a way that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at. And then he put the notebook in his pocket and went back to work. The doctor whose name appeared on the 3rd prescription bottle, the bottle prescribed to a physician, was a man named in various accounts simply as a specialist. His practice was in Beverly Hills. His patient list, insofar as any portion of it has ever been documented, read like the social directory of post-war American cultural and political power. He was the kind of doctor who existed to manage the medical needs of people for whom discretion was not a preference but a requirement. People whose physical vulnerabilities, if known, would have consequences measured not in personal embarrassment, but in political and financial seismic events. He had been maintaining Marilyn Monroe as a patient for approximately 18 months by the time of the dinner at Dean Martin's house. His treatment of her, again insofar as any of it has been documented, was consistent with the standard of care applied to patients suffering from the constellation of anxiety, insomnia, and what would now be recognized as clinical depression that had characterized her health since at least the early 1950s. He prescribed, she received. The relationship was, at its surface, a conventional doctor-patient arrangement, but the bottle in the purse was not conventional. A prescription issued to a physician, issued in a doctor's own name, for medications that a doctor would have had legitimate professional access to without a prescription at all, is not a normal artifact of medical practice. It is a document with a different function entirely. It is a record of a transaction that needed to appear to be something else. The woman who had recognized the name, who had heard it through a screen door at a party, attached to a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, began, in the days after the dinner, to put together what she knew and what she suspected into something approaching a coherent picture. She was not doing this out of civic obligation. She was doing it because she was frightened, and because she had learned, in a particular school of experience that Hollywood provided its female students, that the most dangerous position to occupy was a position of knowing something halfway. Half knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance. It made you a variable, and variables, in the system she was beginning to understand she was adjacent to, got managed, so she kept talking to her trusted contact, and she kept listening. And she started carefully to ask questions in a careful way. Not direct questions, nothing that would flag as inquiry, but the kind of questions that were shaped like social curiosity and arrived disguised as small talk, as gossip, as the normal flow of conversation between people who moved in overlapping circles. What she assembled over weeks was a structure, not a complete one. She was clear about that in later accounts, clear that she was seeing pieces and inferring connections, and that some of her inferences might have been wrong. But the structure, as she understood it, worked roughly as follows. There was a network of prescription medications moving through a particular stratum of Los Angeles society, not illicitly, in the sense of being manufactured outside legitimate pharmaceutical channels. The medications were real, properly produced, properly effective. The illicitness was in the documentation, in the paper trail that theoretically governed who had what and why and when. That paper trail had been, in a number of cases, deliberately obscured, redirected, reassigned. Prescriptions issued to people who hadn't received the medications. Records amended. Quantities adjusted. A system for legitimate controlled substances being quietly operated as something considerably less legitimate. And moving through the system, occupy a position that was in retrospect obvious once you knew to look for it, was Marilyn Monroe. Not as a knowing participant, or at least not fully knowing. She had been told she was doing a favor. The specific nature of the favor had been framed to her in terms that obscured its significance. She was carrying things from one place to another. She was a person no one looked at closely enough to search. She was a vehicle, and she had agreed to be a vehicle because she had been offered something she desperately needed, which was access to a specific medication that her regular physician could no longer prescribe without creating a documentation trail that would attract institutional attention, and which a separate, less institutional arrangement could provide. She needed the medication. Someone needed a carrier. The transaction made a terrible kind of sense. What she hadn't been told, what she perhaps had not allowed herself to think through completely, was who else was involved. Because the network was not only medical, the medications being moved and the documentation being obscured, served purposes that extended well beyond the management of wealthy insomniacs and anxious studio executives. There were people in that network whose need for discretion was not personal but political. There were names attached to the system, not the names on prescription bottles, but the names those names protected, that belonged to a different category of powerful entirely. Dean Martin understood this before almost anyone else explained it to him. He understood it from a fragment Marilyn told him in the hospital room, and from what he already knew, and from particular silence that had surrounded the situation since the dinner. The speed with which things had been smoothed over, the efficiency of the management, the sense that something with a great deal of organizational capacity had simply absorbed the incident and moved on. He did not speak about it publicly. This was not cowardice. It was a calculation of a man who understood the difference between courage and suicide, and who had people in his life whose safety he considered before his own satisfaction at exposure. He made some calls. He asked some questions in a careful way, the same way the woman with the screen door memory had learned to ask. He received from the calls a clearer picture than he had expected. And then he made a different kind of call, to a lawyer, a careful and private one, with whom he had worked before, and he said, "I need you to know something. I don't know what to do with it, but I need someone I trust to know it." The information sat in that lawyer's awareness like a stone dropped into still water, producing rings that moved outward slowly, but inevitably. Over the following months, various elements of what had been in Marilyn Monroe's purse began to create friction in places they hadn't been expected to create friction. A pharmaceutical audit, routine in its stated rationale, turned up anomalies that a thorough investigator connected to a pattern. A journalist who had been following a different story entirely stumbled across a name that rang a bell from an earlier investigation and began pulling a thread that turned out to be connected to a much larger fabric than the one he'd started with. And Robert Callahan, 24 years old, 11 months on the job, 3 younger sisters, Sunday Mass. Robert Callahan opened his personal notebook and looked at the names he'd written in his own shorthand in the back pages, between grocery lists and phone numbers, and decided that the weight of what he was carrying had become, over several months of carrying it, heavier than the consequences of setting it down. He reached out to the journalist, not directly, through an intermediary in a careful way. He provided his notes, his dates, his documented names. He provided the record of the phone call that had told him the matter was closed. He provided the specific language used in that conversation, which he had written down in his personal notebook immediately after the call ended, because something in him had recognized, even then, that the words being used were significant and that significance should be preserved. The story that eventually emerged, published not all at once but in pieces, over nearly 2 years, in venues that operated at a careful distance from the direct Hollywood press ecosystem, was not the story any of its components would have suggested individually. It was not primarily a story about Marilyn Monroe, though she was at its center. It was not primarily a story about prescription medications or pharmaceutical fraud, though those were its mechanisms. It was a story about the infrastructure of discretion that surrounded American power in a particular era, the elaborate Deeply human systems by which the people who control things controlled also the information about themselves. And what happened when those systems were required to accommodate someone as publicly visible, as genuinely fragile, and as ultimately impossible to fully manage as Marilyn Monroe? She was not a knowing villain in this story. The evidence, taken whole, suggests something considerably sadder: a woman who was in genuine medical need, who had been offered a genuine solution to that need, who had been insufficiently curious about the cause of the solution because the need was acute and the offer was immediate, and she was, by 1961, sufficiently exhausted by the effort of being herself that the additional cognitive work of fully examining what she was agreeing to was simply beyond her current capacity. She had been a vehicle. She had not, in any full sense, been a criminal, but she had been used by people who were, and the cream-colored purse with its 3 prescription bottles had been the precise, terrible intersection of her vulnerability and their cynicism. The lives ruined by what was found in it were not ruined all at once. They were ruined in the slow, inevitable way that exposure ruins things. Careers first, then reputations, then the specific social geometries that had taken years to construct and could not survive being understood clearly. The doctor whose name was on the 3rd bottle lost his practice, and then his license, and then his Bel Air house, and then most of the relationships that had been built on the assumption of his continued usefulness. The person whose name was on the 2nd bottle, the name the woman with the screen door memory had recognized, lost considerably more, in ways that were never entirely public, but that people in the relevant circles understood perfectly clearly. There were others, people whose names never appeared in any publication, but who found, in the months following the dinner at Dean Martin's house, that certain doors had quietly closed, that certain calls went unreturned, that the machinery of consideration and accommodation that had, for years, reliably turned on their behalf, had simply stopped. Robert Callahan left the police department 18 months after the dinner. He was 32 when he finally gave his full account on the record to a writer compiling what would become the most thorough contemporaneous investigation of the network. He described what he had seen on the marble floor. He described the names. He described the phone call. He described the weight of carrying information that had been officially deemed not to exist through more than a year continuing to do a job in which the capacity to trust official determinations was foundational. He said, and this was quoted in the piece, because the writer felt correctly that no paraphrase would preserve the specific quality of it, that what had stayed with him most was not the names, not the prescriptions, not the phone call, not even experience of being quietly told that what it clearly seen was not what it clearly seen. What had stayed with him was the image of Marilyn Monroe's face when she was on the floor of that dining room, the way her eyes had moved across the ceiling, the expression that had crossed her face when she'd heard Dean Martin's voice and turned toward it. He said she had looked, in that moment, like someone who had been waiting a very long time to stop pretending to be fine, like someone who had carried something too heavy for too long, and whose body had simply, finally, without consulting her at all, put it down. He said it had looked in a way that he knew was strange to say and couldn't quite help saying anyway, like a kind of relief. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about what Marilyn told him in the hospital. He maintained, with characteristic discipline, the privacy of private things. But people who knew him in the years that followed observed that he spoke about her differently after 1961. Not with more sentiment, exactly, but with a kind of protective precision, a tendency to redirect conversations that moved toward reductive versions of her story, that reached for familiar tragedy of Hollywood narrative and were satisfied with it. He seemed to find that narrative insufficient. He seemed to feel that it missed something essential about the specific person, the specific situation, the specific human accounting of how a woman who had everything the world could see had come to be carrying in a small cream-colored clutch on a Tuesday evening, the evidence of everything the world was not meant to know. She died the following year. The circumstances of her death generated the kind of speculation that attaches itself permanently to the deaths of icons, speculation that has never been fully resolved, that probably cannot be fully resolved, that has become in some ways a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, rather than a question anyone expects to have answered. The people who were closest to the investigation of those circumstances were, several of them, people who already knew what had been in the purse. Whether that knowledge connects to how she died, or only to how she lived in the years before she died, is a question that different people, reviewing the same available evidence, have reached different conclusions about. What is not in question is the following. In the months after the dinner at Dean Martin's house, several things happened that did not happen by coincidence. A pharmaceutical investigation found what it found. A journalist followed a thread he wouldn't have had occasion to follow otherwise. A young police officer wrote names in a personal notebook that eventually reached the public record. And a woman whose name is still not published, who had heard a name through a screen door at a party she hadn't been meant to attend. Continue making careful calls and asking careful questions in the careful way, until the careful questions had assembled themselves into a careful shape that several powerful people found it very inconvenient to have assembled. The purse was, in the end, just a purse, small and cream-colored, and no more significant materially than 1,000 other purses that had been photographed over the years on Marilyn Monroe's arm or clutched in her famous hands. But it had fallen at the wrong angle or the right one, and it had come open, and what was inside it had been seen by the right eyes or the wrong ones, and the world that had carefully arranged itself around the assumption that such things would remain unseen had to slowly, expensively, permanently rearrange itself. Robert Callahan has lived, in the decades since, in a quiet suburb of a medium-sized American city that he has requested not be specified. He is old now. He has a garden. His 3 younger sisters have families of their own. He has never returned to law enforcement. He has given, by his count, 7 substantial on-the-record accounts of what he witnessed to journalists, to documentary filmmakers, to a researcher compiling an oral history of the period. Each time he tells it the same way. He does not embellish. He does not theorize beyond what he observed. He is still a methodical person. But there is always a moment in the telling. Observers have noted it consistently. When he reaches the part about the floor of Dean Martin's dining room and the purse and the names, and he pauses. Not for effect. The pause is not theatrical. It has the quality, instead, of a person returning to a room. They spent a long time trying to leave and finding it exactly as they left it. Every object in the same position. The same quality of light coming to the same window. The same particular stillness of a place where something happened that can't be undone. He says each time that he has thought about those few minutes on the marble floor almost every day of his adult life. Not with guilt, not with regret. Exactly. With something he has difficulty naming, which is a particular kind of wondering that attaches to moments where the entire subsequent course of things hung on a decision made in 11 months of experience and 24 years of life. He had crouched down. He had looked. He had written things down. He had done his job. He wonders, sometimes, what happens to a version of him that doesn't crouch down, that sees the purse and leaves it, that writes a different report, or no report at all. He wonders about that version. Not because he wishes he were that version, but because imagining has helped him, over the years, understand the value of the version he actually is. The version who wrote the names down, who answered the journalist's call, who sat in front of the camera more than once, in the good plain light of his own accountability, and said, "This is what I saw, and this is what was done with what I saw, and this is why it matters that I tell you." Marilyn Monroe collapsed at Dean Martin's dinner on a Tuesday evening in 1961, and a cream-colored clutch purse fell to the floor and came open, and what spilled was not just 3 small bottles with wrong names on them, but something much harder to contain. The evidence that the most famous woman in the world had been living beneath the performance and the photographs and the extraordinary visible life, a hidden life that intersected with powers and systems she had not fully understood, carrying their secrets in plain sight, protected by the paradox of her own fame. The people who were ruined by what was found had, each of them, constructed their safety on the assumption that the invisible would stay invisible, that the famous woman with the famous purse would always be photographed but never searched, that the system they had built in the spaces between the visible world and the actual one would continue to function undisturbed, because it had always functioned undisturbed, and the confidence of the long undisturbed is a powerful sedative. It took one fall, one broken class, one methodical young man with a personal notebook and belief, tested and battered but ultimately surviving, that the names of things mattered. And then it took time, the slow, grinding, uncinematic time of journalism and investigation and institutional friction, for the damage to become visible in ways that could not be managed away. But it began on a marble floor in candlelight, with the sound of breaking crystal still in the air, and Marilyn Monroe's eyes moving slowly across the ceiling, and Dean Martin's voice saying her name in the dark. That is where it began. And what it means about visibility and invisibility, about the famous and the powerful, about the systems we build to protect ourselves and the impossibility of building them well enough against the ordinary, terrible contingency of fall, is something that the people who have spent time with this story tend to find difficult to leave behind. They find in the room with them, still, years later, the way Robert Callahan finds it. The quiet, marble, candlelit room and the purse and the names and the world had been arranged so carefully around the certainty that none of it would ever need to be explained.